Welcome back. I'm so excited to get started on this second video in our series of tips and tools to create meaningful learning experiences. If you remember, last week's video was on movement, and let's get started. So today we're going to talk about visual input and the use of visuals as part of a learning tool. To continue our conversation on the why and understanding why the visuals are so important, let's go back to our brain. If you remember, we have the parietal, the frontal, and the temporal lobes that are all part of the learning process. When we begin to understand that the visual cortex itself sits on the back of the brain, it sits literally in that hole of the occipital lobe, but it reaches forward into the parietal lobe. This is significant because that means that that whole occipital visual cortex is connected into all of the learning centers of the brain. If you remember our brain hat from last time, and again, if you'd like to download this, by all means go to our brain resources on our website at with-respect.com. We can't see the visual cortex here, so let's find a way to understand where the visual cortex is. If this is your brain, okay, here's our frontal cortex, the boss of the brain. Back here, this, our occipital. Our occipital is connected throughout the visual cortex, okay? That means the motor cortex runs here, the visual cortex runs here. Remembering this is the occipital and into the parietal, this is the way that we know that the visual cortex runs directly into all of this. When we talk about visual input, John Medina reminds us that back in the day, when we were still at the bottom of the food chain, it really was all about what you could see, and you had to scan the environment. Our survival meant it was crucial. The other part of that, connected to last week, is movement. Staying on the move was another way that we survived, not because we were bigger or had bigger teeth or bigger claws, but because we could move and we could spot trouble immediately. Our brain is still wired that way. It's still all connected and says, oh, visual input and movement, the two most important components of how I take in information. So what do we mean when we talk about visual input? One of the things that I find extremely frustrating about things like PowerPoint, which could be an amazing tool for visual input, is when people use that and they put words, and that's all that's there is words. That's not visual input. Yes, the visual cortex is identifying it, but what's not happening is the symbolic representation that transfers into a different idea of what learning means. Understanding visual as another modality of learning, so the brain likes input coming in a multitude of different ways. Visual, auditory, kinesthetic. Think about the excitement that we have when we watch movies. It is not simply about any words on that screen. It's what excites us, right? What puts that emotional engagement in place has to do with the visuals. So thinking about visual input as a second modality to being able to express and understand information. Visual representation can be translated into a whole lot of different ways to represent information. We can use visual objects to relay concepts. For example, anyone who's ever been in a training with me knows that this is the ball of perspective. It's a two-sided ball with two colors. We talk about this and use this as that physical representation to understand the concept of perspective. 99% of the people who have come through at least one of our trainings never looks at a two-sided ball the same way. That's because this has become that physical representation, that visual cue that says, oh, this is about perspective, recognizing and understanding that. Another example. In our self-care toolboxes, we often have what we call a swirly jar. This is a physical representation that when we begin to talk about and explain how we can take 2 steps back, deep breath, and all those swirling emotions settle. Okay? This is an active representation. This is a stationary representation. So 2 different kinds of concepts, but this is that visual that represents that concept. The cool thing about visual input is that it can be conjured as well as real. Once I have presented this idea of the ball of perspective, I now do not always have to have the ball of perspective in my hand to conjure that vision for you. That idea of conjured, we have to have a commonality in our culture, right? So if I live in a culture where cigars, for example, are not something common, that's not necessarily something that I'm going to use a word and try and conjure a physical representation. On the other hand, cars, right? 99% of our cultures have access to cars. We know what a car is. So if I'm talking about a car, I'm going to correlate that to an analogy. Everybody can conjure what that looks like. We also have what we have come to know as infographics, where there's text, visualizations, and put it all together to be able to express a concept. In our work, we use the behavior paradigm as part of this expression through an infographic. Another really important component of visual input is when we start to talk about statistics. Statistics can bore people straight out of their mind, brains shut down, go to sleep, we're all done, right? Because even if I show it to you on a visual, 60% of students in high school who engage in bullying behavior will have a criminal record by the time they are 24 years old. Now, there are people who this type of input is crucial. They like visual linguistic information. So it's relevant, right? We're talking about multimodal. But it becomes much more real and much more informative for many of us visually when I show you exactly what, here are our 10 students who are engaged in bullying behavior, and this is what happens when 6 of them now have a criminal record. We begin to understand the information differently, recognizing too that we have graphs and charts and all of those physical representations as another way to visually provide information. Another really important thing to understand about visual, if there is a conflict in what we hear and what we see, we believe what we see. This is significant. Because if I have a piece of information that is on the board that says something that is not the same as what my words are saying, what is on the board is going to be remembered long after. It is also going to quickly draw their attention, and they're going to point out that what they see and what they've heard are in conflict. I'm really excited about next week's video. It's on memory and recall and how we can reinforce those things in the process of how we design and deliver. And lastly, I want to tell you about a really cool new opportunity that starts next week with the 3rd video. We are opening an online course called Mini Badass Trainer Bootcamp, which is the prequel to our intensive Badass Trainer Bootcamp. It's been great to have you today. I'm looking forward to your comments and what you might have to add to this. By all means, I invite you to let me know, what is it that you do that increases and reinforces that visual input? What are we learning in these videos together? Is this beneficial? Let me know in the comments below. I want to invite you to connect with us as well if you haven't already through LinkedIn. Also, refer a friend. I'm sure you have a colleague who would benefit from this information. By all means, have them come on in. Thanks for joining us. See you soon.